the history of drive-in movie theaters. The gravel crunches softly under the tires as the car rolls into the lot. The engine stops. Through the windshield, a large white screen rises against the darkening sky, its surface blank for now, waiting for the sun to set completely before the first images will appear. Other cars are already here, scattered across the gently sloped parking area, their occupants settling in, adjusting positions, preparing for the show that will begin in perhaps 20 minutes, perhaps half an hour, whenever the light fades enough. This is a drive-in movie theater, not a cinema with rows of seats bolted to a sloped floor, not a multiplex with a dozen screens showing films at staggered times, just an open field with a screen at one end, a low building with a concession stand in the middle, and spaces marked out for cars to park in rows that face the screen. The setup is simple, almost rudimentary, yet it represents something specific in American cultural history, a way of watching movies that combined the mobility of the automobile with the communal experience of cinema. The story of how these places came to exist, how they spread across the country, how they became woven into the fabric of American life for several decades, and how most of them eventually disappeared, that story spans nearly a century. It moves from the early experiments of one man in New Jersey through the explosive growth of the postwar years, through gradual decline, and into a present where drive-ins exist in small numbers, serving a niche but devoted audience. The telling will be slow and detailed, attentive to the specifics of each era, the changes in design and technology, the ways people used these spaces, and what the experience meant to different generations. There's no need to rush. The screen will wait, the projector will wait, and the story, like the best drive-in double features, will unfold at its own unhurried pace. Outside the car, the air is cooling as evening settles in. The sky transitions from blue to deeper shades, the sun having already dropped below the horizon. A few stars are becoming visible. In the distance, children's voices carry across the lot. Families have arrived early, and the kids are playing on the small playground equipment near the screen, making the most of the last light before they'll need to return to their cars for the show. The concession stand is doing steady business. People walk back and forth between their cars and the building, carrying cardboard trays loaded with popcorn, hot dogs, drinks. The smell of popcorn is strong, mixed with the scent of grilled food and the faint odor of car exhaust from vehicles that arrived moments ago. These smells, along with the visual tableau of cars arranged in rows and the anticipation of the coming darkness, create an atmosphere that is distinct, recognizable, part of the drive-in experience. This experience, sitting in a car in an open field waiting for a movie to start, would have been impossible to imagine before the 1930s. It required several elements to come together: widespread automobile ownership, the technology to project images on a large outdoor screen, the cultural acceptance of outdoor entertainment, and the availability of inexpensive land on the edges of towns. All of these came together in a specific moment in American history, creating conditions where drive-in theaters could emerge and flourish. The story begins with one person's idea, tested patiently in his own driveway. 1930s origins, Richard Hollingshead and the first drive-in. In the early 1930s, automobiles were no longer rare novelties, but were becoming standard features of American life. Families owned cars, people drove to work, to stores, to visit friends. The car was transforming American geography, making distances that had once required hours on foot or by horse manageable in minutes. Roads were improving, gas stations were proliferating. The automobile was remaking the landscape. At the same time, movies were enormously popular. The late 1920s and early 1930s were the era of the movie palace, grand theatres in city centres with ornate architecture, plush seating, and elaborate decorations. Going to the movies was a formal experience, often requiring nice clothes and proper behaviour. Theatres had ushers, dress codes, and expectations about conduct. For many people, particularly those with young children or those who lived in less affluent circumstances, the movie palace experience could feel intimidating or impractical. Richard Hollingshead Jr., who lived in Camden, New Jersey, began thinking about these constraints. He worked for his father's company, Whiz Auto Products, which sold automotive accessories. He understood cars. He also enjoyed movies. And he began to wonder whether there might be a way to combine the two, to create a movie-watching experience that didn't require leaving your car. The idea had practical appeal. In a car, you could wear whatever you wanted. You could talk without disturbing strangers. You could bring your children without worrying about them crying or fidgeting in a theatre full of people. The car provided privacy, comfort, and flexibility that a traditional theatre couldn't match. Hollingshead began experimenting at his home in 1932. He set up a 1928 Kodak projector on the hood of his car. He hung a screen, accounts vary, but it was likely a sheet or similar material, between trees in his driveway. He positioned cars at different angles and distances to see how well the projected image could be viewed from various positions. He wanted to understand the geometry of the setup, to figure out how cars could be arranged so that everyone had a clear view. The experiments were methodical. Hollingshead tested different screen sizes and projection distances. He tried various arrangements of vehicles. He even used a garden hose to spray water, simulating rain, to see how weather might affect visibility and whether outdoor projection was viable in less than perfect conditions. These weren't glamorous experiments, just a man in his driveway, working out practical problems with whatever materials he had available. From this patient testing, Hollingshead developed the basic concept: a large outdoor screen, a projector at an appropriate distance, and parking spaces arranged so that viewers in cars could see the screen without obstruction. He applied for a patent in August 1932, which was granted in May 1933. The patent described a system for outdoor movie viewing from automobiles, including the ramped parking arrangement that would become standard at drive-ins. With the concept proven and patented, Hollingshead moved to create an actual theatre. He found land on Admiral Wilson Boulevard near Camden, New Jersey. The location was outside the city centre, where land was cheaper and where there was room for the large open space a drive-in required. He partnered with Willie Warren Smith, a cousin, to finance and build the facility. On June 6, 1933, the first drive-in theatre opened to the public. It was sometimes called the Automobile Movie Theatre and sometimes the Park-in Theatre, emphasizing the simple act of arriving, parking, and watching. The name drive-in would come later, but the concept was established from the beginning. The theatre could accommodate about 400 cars, though reports vary on the exact capacity. The screen was large, approximately 40 feet by 50 feet, and positioned at one end of the lot. The projection booth was at the opposite end, with the projector aimed across the open space toward the screen. Between the booth and the screen, the lot was graded with a gentle slope, with each row of parking spaces slightly higher than the one in front, so that cars could see over each other. Sound was handled through large speakers mounted near the screen. The audio from the film was amplified and broadcast across the entire lot. This meant everyone heard the same volume and there was no individual control. The sound quality was acceptable but not ideal. Wind could carry sound away, and cars farther from the speakers had trouble hearing clearly. But it worked well enough for the purpose. The first film shown at Hollingshead's Drive-In was Wife Beware, a comedy from 1933. Admission was 25 cents per car plus 25 cents per person, with a maximum charge of $1 per car, regardless of how many people it held. This pricing structure would become typical at drive-ins, a per-car charge that made it economical for families or groups to attend together. The opening night drew curiosity and some press attention. The concept was novel. People wanted to see whether watching a movie from a car would actually work, whether it would be enjoyable, whether it was just a gimmick or something that might have staying power. Reception was mixed. Some people enjoyed the novelty and the comfort of staying in their cars. Others found the sound quality poor and the viewing experience inferior to indoor theaters. The weather was a factor. Rain, wind, or extreme heat could make the experience unpleasant, and there were technical issues to work out. The projected image had to be bright enough to be visible from the back rows, which required powerful projection equipment. The screen had to be large enough to be seen clearly from hundreds of feet away. The parking arrangement had to prevent larger vehicles from blocking the view of those behind them. Despite these challenges, Hollingshead's theatre operated for several years. It didn't immediately spawn hundreds of imitators, but it proved that the concept could work. Other entrepreneurs took notice. Throughout the rest of the 1930s, a handful of additional drive-ins opened in various parts of the country, in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, California, and a few other states. The numbers remained small, perhaps a dozen or two by the end of the decade, but the idea was out there, waiting for conditions that would allow it to flourish. The 1930s were difficult economic years. The Great Depression meant that discretionary spending was limited, and large capital investments in new entertainment ventures were rare. Building a drive-in required acquiring land, constructing a screen and projection booth, grading and paving a parking area, and obtaining projection equipment. These were significant expenses, and banks were cautious about lending for speculative ventures. So the drive-in remained a curiosity through the 1930s, an interesting experiment, a novel form of entertainment, but not yet a widespread phenomenon. That would change in the following decade as new technologies improved the experience and as American car culture began to reshape the landscape in ways that made drive-ins not just viable, but ideal for a changing society. 1940s, wartime constraints and key innovations. The 1940s began with the United States still emerging from the Depression, and then were dominated by World War II and its aftermath. These were years of constraint and change, and they affected drive-in theaters in complex ways. During the early 1940s, the war effort consumed resources and attention. Construction of new commercial facilities was limited because materials like steel and lumber were needed for military purposes. Gasoline was rationed, which reduced leisure driving. Rubber shortages affected tire availability, making long trips less practical. These constraints slowed the growth of drive-ins during the war years. However, the concept continued to develop. The drive-ins that did operate during this period experimented with improvements to address the shortcomings of the original design. The most significant innovation of the 1940s was the introduction of individual in-car speakers. The original drive-ins had relied on large speakers near the screen, broadcasting sound across the entire lot. This created several problems. The volume had to be loud enough for cars in the back to hear, which meant it was often too loud for cars near the front. The sound could disturb nearby residents, leading to complaints and sometimes legal issues. Wind and ambient noise could make dialogue difficult to understand. And viewers had no control over the volume. They heard whatever the theatre chose to broadcast. The solution was a system of individual speakers, one for each parking space. The exact origin of this innovation is disputed. Several inventors and companies developed similar systems in the 1940s, but by the middle of the decade, the technology was being widely adopted at new and existing drive-ins. The speakers were small, enclosed in metal housings, and mounted on posts positioned between parking spaces. Each post served 2 spaces, with speakers hanging from wires on either side. When a car pulled into a space, the driver would roll down the window and hook the speaker onto the glass, letting it hang inside the car. The speaker had a volume control, allowing each viewer to adjust the sound to their preference. This system transformed the drive-in experience. It eliminated the noise problem that had plagued outdoor theatres, as sound was now contained within individual vehicles rather than broadcast across the neighbourhood. It gave viewers control over their audio experience, allowing them to set comfortable volume levels. And it made the viewing experience more intimate. The sound was right there in the car, creating a private theatre environment, even while parked in a lot with hundreds of other vehicles. The in-car speaker became one of the defining features of drive-in theatres. The image of the metal speaker box hanging from a car window, its cord stretching back to the post, became iconic. People who attended drive-ins in the decades that followed would remember the slight heft of the speaker, the texture of its perforated metal grille, the satisfying click of the volume knob as it turned. Other design refinements emerged during the 1940s as well. Parking rows were engineered with more precision, using ramps or berms to create consistent sightlines. Each row would be elevated slightly above the one in front, ensuring that cars tilted gently upward toward the screen. This ramp system solved the problem of vehicles blocking each other's views and became standard at drive-ins built from the mid-1940s onward. Projection technology improved as well. Projectors became more powerful and more reliable, capable of throwing bright images across the large distances required for outdoor screening. Screen materials evolved to reflect light more efficiently, improving image quality even for viewers in the back rows. By the late 1940s, as the war ended and the American economy shifted back to civilian production, conditions were changing in ways that would prove ideal for drive-in expansion. Veterans were returning home, starting families, moving to new suburban neighborhoods. The automobile industry, which had been building tanks and military vehicles during the war, resumed production of passenger cars. Pent-up demand for housing, consumer goods, and entertainment created a boom economy. This was the environment in which drive-in theaters would explode from a niche novelty to a mainstream American institution. Late 1940s to 1950s, postwar expansion, and suburban car culture. The period from the late 1940s through the 1950s was the great age of drive-in expansion. The number of theatres grew from a few dozen to several thousand. Drive-ins became familiar features of American life, woven into the routines and memories of millions of families. Several factors drove this growth. The most fundamental was the transformation of American geography and lifestyle in the post-war years. Before the war, most Americans had lived in cities or small towns, often in relatively dense neighborhoods where walking or public transit was practical for daily needs. After the war, new housing developments spread outward from city centers, creating suburbs where almost every aspect of life required a car. These suburban developments were made possible by federal programs that offered low-interest loans to veterans for home purchases, by highway construction that connected suburbs to urban job centers, and by the mass production of affordable automobiles. Families moved into new houses in new neighborhoods, often far from the downtowns where movie palaces and other entertainment venues were located. Drive-in theaters fit perfectly into this new suburban landscape. They were built on the outskirts of towns, where land was relatively inexpensive and plentiful. A drive-in needed several acres, enough space for a screen, a projection booth and concession building, and parking for hundreds of cars. In established urban areas, such large plots were expensive and scarce. In the developing suburbs and on the edges of smaller towns, they were abundant and affordable. The typical site for a new drive-in was agricultural land or undeveloped property along a highway or major road. Developers would purchase the land, level and grade it, construct the necessary buildings and screen, install the speaker system and projection equipment, and pave or gravel the parking area. The capital investment was substantial but manageable, especially as specialized companies emerged to provide turnkey drive-in construction services. The economics were attractive. Operating costs were relatively low. Staff was needed only during evening hours when the theatre was open, and the facility sat unused during daylight. Revenue came from admission fees and concession sales. A well-located drive-in could quickly recoup its construction costs and become profitable. From about 1948 through the mid-1950s, drive-ins proliferated at an extraordinary rate. Industry publications tracked openings, and the numbers grew year by year. By the early 1950s, there were well over 3,000 drive-ins operating in the United States. By the end of the decade, the number approached 5,000. This represented a massive infrastructure build-out, comparable to the expansion of shopping centers or motels during the same period. The growth wasn't evenly distributed. Drive-ins were more common in regions with favorable weather, the South, the Southwest, California, where outdoor entertainment was practical for much of the year. They were less common in areas with harsh winters, though northern states still had significant numbers of seasonal drive-ins that operated from spring through fall. For many families, the drive-in became a regular weekend activity. On Friday or Saturday nights, parents would load children into the car and drive to the local drive-in. The experience had several advantages over indoor theatres, particularly for families with young children. Cost was one factor. Drive-ins typically charged admission per car rather than per person, or they offered very low prices for children. A family of 4 or 5 could attend for less than the cost of individual tickets at an indoor theatre. The per-car pricing made large families or groups economical to accommodate. Flexibility was another advantage. At a drive-in, children could wear pajamas and bring pillows and blankets. They could eat snacks from home in addition to what was purchased at the concession stand. If a child became fussy or tired, the parents didn't have to leave the theatre. They could simply let the child fall asleep in the back seat while they continued watching the film. This informal, relaxed atmosphere was particularly appealing to parents who might have felt stressed by the demands of managing children in a formal indoor theatre. The car itself provided a sense of privacy and control. Inside your vehicle, you could talk, adjust the volume, rearrange seating, and generally behave as if you were in your living room rather than in public. This privacy made the drive-in feel less constraining than traditional theatres, where silence and stillness were expected. Drive-ins also functioned as social spaces. Families would arrive early to get good spots, and children would play in the open areas before the show started. Many drive-ins installed small playgrounds near the screen, swing sets, slides, maybe a merry-go-round or seesaw. These playgrounds gave children a place to burn off energy before settling into the car for the movie. Parents could watch from their vehicles while kids played in the fading light, the whole scene taking on an impromptu park-like quality. As darkness fell and the show time approached, families would return to their cars. The ritual of settling in was consistent. Find your speaker post, pull up so the post is beside your window, roll down the window, hook the speaker inside, adjust the volume, arrange seats and blankets for comfort. This routine became deeply familiar to regular attendees, a small but satisfying set of actions that marked the transition from everyday life to the special time of the movie. The films shown at drive-ins during this era varied. Major studios initially resisted releasing first-run films to drive-ins, preferring to give them exclusive runs in their own theatres. But as drive-ins proved their profitability and their large audience, studios began making films available more readily. Drive-ins typically showed the same kinds of films that played in indoor theatres: Hollywood features, westerns, comedies, dramas, musicals. However, drive-ins quickly developed a reputation for family-friendly programming. Because they attracted families with children, theatre owners often chose films that would appeal to this demographic. Animated films, adventure stories, and wholesome comedies were common. Disney films were particularly popular at drive-ins, where families could bring children to see the latest animated feature in an environment where noise and movement weren't disruptive. Double features became standard at many drive-ins. The theatre would show 2 films for the price of 1 admission, often starting at dusk and continuing past midnight. The first film was usually a major feature, while the second might be an older film, a B-movie, or a less popular title. The double feature provided value and helped justify the evening excursion. It was an entire evening's entertainment rather than just a single film. The intermission between films became an institution in itself. During this break, which might last 15 or 20 minutes, the screen would show advertisements for the concession stand, animated snacks dancing across the screen, jingles urging viewers to visit the snack bar, countdown clocks showing how much time remained before the second feature. These intermission reels have become iconic pieces of drive-in culture, remembered fondly by people who grew up attending these theatres. The concession stand was crucial to drive-in economics. While admission fees covered operating costs, profit margins were often thin. Concession sales, popcorn, candy, soda, hot dogs, hamburgers, provided the real profitability. Theatre owners encouraged concession purchases through the intermission advertising, through competitive pricing that made snacks seem like good value, and through the simple fact that watching a movie made people hungry and thirsty. The concession building at a drive-in was typically a utilitarian structure, concrete block or similar construction, brightly lit, with serving windows or counters where customers ordered and picked up food. Inside, staff worked efficiently to prepare and serve food to potentially hundreds of customers during the intermission rush. The menu was straightforward, items that could be prepared quickly, served hot, and carried back to the car without too much difficulty. The walk to the concession stand and back became part of the drive-in experience. People would leave their cars, walk across the parking lot, often still hearing the audio from their car's speaker or from nearby cars, join the line at the concession stand, make their purchases, and walk back. On cool nights, the walk provided a chance to stretch and warm up. The concession building was usually heated and well lit, a beacon of light and activity in the middle of the dark lot. All of these elements, the car-based viewing, the family-friendly atmosphere, the double features, the concession stands, the playgrounds, combined to create an experience that felt distinctly American and distinctly of its time. Drive-ins embodied the post-war prosperity, the centrality of the automobile, the suburban lifestyle, and the emphasis on family leisure that characterized the 1950s. The visual imagery of drive-ins from this era has become iconic. Rows of cars with their headlights off, facing a massive screen glowing in the darkness, the soft glow of dashboard lights and speaker cables, children asleep in back seats, couples in front seats sharing popcorn and watching the film. These images have been reproduced in countless photographs, films, and artistic representations, cementing the drive-in's place in American cultural memory. But the drive-in served another audience as well, one that would become increasingly important in the 1960s and 1970s. Teenagers. 1950s to 1960s. Teenage culture and the drive-in as social space. For teenagers, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s, the drive-in represented something different than it did for families. It was a place of independence, a space where young people could go without parental supervision, where the social possibilities were at least as important as the film on the screen. The post-war generation of teenagers was the first to have widespread access to cars. In earlier decades, automobiles had been expensive and car ownership among young people was rare. But by the 1950s, used cars were affordable, and many teenagers worked part-time jobs that allowed them to buy and maintain vehicles. The car became central to teenage social life. It provided mobility, privacy, and status. Drive-in theatres became natural gathering places for this car-centered teenage culture. Going to the drive-in was an accepted social activity that parents generally approved of. They knew where their kids were going. They knew approximately when they'd be back, and the activity seemed wholesome enough. Watching a movie, after all, however chaperoned by darkness and distance it might be. Teenagers attended drive-ins in several contexts. Groups of friends might go together, piling into a single car, splitting the admission cost, and treating the evening as a social outing. The film might be watched attentively or might serve mainly as background to conversations and socializing. Cars would be parked near each other, and teens would move between vehicles, visiting and talking, creating small social clusters within the larger lot. Dating couples found the drive-in particularly appealing. The combination of public setting and private car created a socially acceptable context for time alone together. Parents tolerated drive-in dates because they were supervised by the public nature of the venue, while still allowing young couples some privacy within their vehicle. The darkness, the focus of attention on the screen, and the enclosed space of the car created an intimate atmosphere. This aspect of drive-in culture became the subject of countless jokes, songs, and cultural references. The phrase passion pit, sometimes used to describe drive-ins, reflected the perception that romantic activity was as much a part of the drive-in experience as the films themselves. While this was often exaggerated for comedic effect, it's true that drive-ins provided teenagers with privacy that was difficult to find elsewhere. Theatre owners were aware of this dynamic and generally tolerated it within reasonable bounds. Staff might patrol the lot periodically, partly for security and partly to discourage behavior that went beyond what was considered acceptable. The goal was to maintain the family-friendly reputation that attracted parents and children, while also accommodating the teenage audience that provided substantial revenue. The layout of drive-in lots sometimes reflected this dual function. Families often preferred to park in the middle sections, where they could see well and be surrounded by other families. Teenagers often preferred the back rows or the edges of the lot, where cars were more isolated and the screen might be visible, but not necessarily the primary focus of attention. Some drive-ins installed security measures to manage the teenage audience. Fences around the perimeter prevented people from sneaking in without paying. Staff might check cars at the entrance to ensure the correct admission was paid. Patrol of the lot during the show discouraged vandalism or excessive noise. These measures were generally low-key, sufficient to maintain order without creating an oppressive atmosphere. Despite occasional concerns about teenage behavior, drive-ins remained popular with this demographic throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. They were spaces where young people could experience a degree of independence, where social interactions could unfold with less adult supervision than was typical in that era, yet within a framework that was broadly acceptable to parents and communities. This teenage drive-in culture became a staple of period films and television shows set in the 1950s and 1960s. The image of teenagers in a convertible at a drive-in, the boy with his arm around the girl, both watching a monster movie or romantic comedy. This became a cultural shorthand for that era's youth culture, even though it represented just one aspect of a more complex reality. The drive-in's role in teenage social life declined in later decades as indoor multiplexes became more common and as changes in dating culture shifted social patterns. But for a generation of Americans who came of age in the 1950s and 1960s, the drive-in remained a powerful memory associated with first dates, early experiences of independence, and the particular freedoms and constraints of adolescence in that period. 1960s to 1970s, the peak era and classic drive-in design. By the 1960s, drive-in theatres had reached their mature form. The basic design had been refined through decades of experimentation, and the operational model had been perfected. This was the peak era, when drive-ins were at their most numerous and most culturally prominent. The classic drive-in theatre of the 1960s and 1970s followed a recognizable pattern. At the front of the lot stood the screen, a massive structure that dominated the landscape. These screens were typically 40 to 60 feet tall and proportionally wide, creating a viewing surface that could be seen clearly from hundreds of feet away. The screen structure was usually steel or wood framing, covered with a white surface designed to reflect projected light evenly. Some screens were simple, functional structures. Others featured decorative elements, murals, geometric designs, or architectural details that made them landmarks visible from nearby highways. The screen often served as advertising for the theatre itself, with the drive-in's name prominently displayed. At night, with the projector running, the screen became a beacon visible for miles, a glowing rectangle in the darkness. Behind or beside the screen, many drive-ins had storage areas, offices, or additional structures. The back of the screen was typically bare framing, visible from the highway behind the theatre. Some owners painted these backs or hung advertising visible to passing traffic, turning the screen into a two-sided billboard. In the center or back of the lot was the projection booth and concession building. This structure housed the projectors that threw the image onto the distant screen, along with the snack bar that served hundreds of customers during intermissions. The building was typically low and functional, designed for efficiency rather than aesthetics. Inside the projection booth, operators managed the film reels. In this era before digital projection, films came in multiple reels that had to be threaded onto large projectors. Professional projectionists would time the reel changes carefully to create seamless transitions, though occasionally mishaps would result in brief interruptions visible as the film jumped or went dark for a moment. The projection equipment had to be powerful. The beam of light had to travel hundreds of feet and remain bright enough to create a clear image on the enormous screen. Below the projection booth, the concession stand operated as a miniature fast food operation. Commercial kitchens prepared hot food, hamburgers, hot dogs, pizza in later years. Popcorn machines produced the signature snack in large quantities. Soft drink dispensers, candy displays, and other offerings rounded out the menu. The staff had to be able to serve potentially hundreds of customers in the 15 or 20 minutes of an intermission, creating a frantic but well-choreographed rush of activity. In the parking area, the speaker posts had become refined to their classic form. Metal poles perhaps 4 feet tall, painted to be visible in the dark, positioned precisely between parking spaces. Each post had speakers on wires hanging from either side, one for the car to the left, one for the car to the right. The wires were long enough to reach into the car when the window was rolled down, and they included a hook that could be hung on the glass to hold the speaker in place. The speakers themselves were remarkably similar across different theatres. They were rectangular boxes, perhaps 6 inches by 4 inches by 2 inches, made of metal with perforated fronts to let sound out. On the side or bottom was a volume knob, a simple rotating dial that increased or decreased the sound. The speakers weren't high-fidelity audio equipment. They had a tinny quality, with limited bass response and a tendency to distort at high volume. But they worked well enough for the purpose, and their sound quality was good enough that the dialogue and music of the film came through clearly. The speaker system created challenges for theatre maintenance. Speakers were frequently damaged. Customers would drive away with them still attached, pulling the wires from the posts. Weather deteriorated the enclosures and the wiring. Vandalism was an ongoing concern. Theatre staff spent considerable time repairing and replacing speakers, a never-ending maintenance task that was simply part of drive-in operations. The parking spaces themselves were marked in various ways. Some theatres painted lines on pavement. Others used gravel or dirt surfaces with markers indicating where cars should position. The key was the ramp system. Each row was elevated above the one in front, creating a gentle upward slope as you moved back from the screen. This meant that a car in the 10th row was parking on ground, perhaps a foot or two higher than a car in the first row, with each intermediate row raised proportionally. This ramping solved the sight line problem that had plagued early drive-ins. With each car tilted slightly upward, even a large vehicle in front couldn't block the view of smaller cars behind. The system worked well, though it required careful grading and periodic maintenance to keep the ramps at the correct angles. Capacity at drive-ins varied widely. A small facility might have parking for 200 cars. Larger operations could accommodate 500 to 1,000 vehicles. A few mega drive-ins built in favorable locations could handle even more. The total attendance at a sold-out show could easily reach 2,000 to 4,000 people when accounting for multiple passengers per car. The visual spectacle of a full drive-in was remarkable. Hundreds of cars arranged in precise rows, all facing the same direction, all dark except for the faint glow of dashboard lights and the occasional cigarette lighter. Above them, the massive screen displaying the film. Around them, the darkness of the open field, the distant lights of the highway, the vast sky overhead. It was a uniquely American scene, combining technology, automobiles, entertainment, and landscape in a way that existed nowhere else. The drive-in reached its peak numbers in the 1960s. Estimates suggest there were as many as 4,000 to 5,000 drive-in theaters operating in the United States by the middle of the decade. This meant that in many parts of the country, drive-ins were within easy driving distance of most families. They had become normalized, a standard option for weekend entertainment, as familiar as indoor theaters or bowling alleys. 1960s to 1970s, B-movies, horror, and late-night programming expanded. As drive-ins matured through the 1960s and into the 1970s, their programming began to shift in ways that would come to define how people remember this era. Major Hollywood studios, which had initially been reluctant to release films to drive-ins, now recognized them as an important distribution channel. However, the most prestigious releases, big-budget spectacles, important dramas, films competing for awards, still premiered in downtown first-run theaters and only reached drive-ins weeks or months later, if at all. This meant that drive-ins increasingly filled their schedules with second-run films, double features pairing older movies, and low-budget genre pictures that might never have played in premium indoor venues. This programming shift aligned with changes in the drive-in audience and with the economics of film distribution in ways that would transform the cultural role of these outdoor theaters. The rise of television in the 1950s and 1960s affected all movie theaters, but drive-ins adapted by emphasizing what they did differently. Television offered convenient home entertainment, but it couldn't replicate the scale of a drive-in screen, the experience of being outdoors, or the social atmosphere of the car-based theater. Drive-ins positioned themselves as special occasion destinations, places you went for the experience as much as for any particular film. One significant adaptation was late-night programming. Drive-ins began scheduling later shows, sometimes starting at midnight or even later on Friday and Saturday nights, featuring films that appealed to teenagers and young adults rather than families. These late shows often programmed horror movies, science fiction, exploitation films, and other genre pictures that played well to enthusiastic audiences who came as much for the social experience as for the films themselves. The late-night drive-in had a different atmosphere than the family-oriented early evening shows. By the time midnight approached, the younger children had gone home. The cars that remained in the lot, or that arrived specifically for the late show, contained primarily teenagers and young adults. The mood was more boisterous, more social, less constrained by the need to keep quiet for sleeping children or maintain family-appropriate behavior. Groups of friends would arrive together, sometimes with more people than the car was designed to hold. Cars would park near each other, and people would move between vehicles, visiting and socializing. Some viewers would bring lawn chairs and sit outside their cars, weather permitting, creating impromptu gathering spots in the parking area. Blankets would be spread on car hoods or on the ground. The drive-in became an outdoor party that happened to have a movie playing in the background. Horror films in particular became associated with drive-in culture during this period. The genre had always existed, but the late 1960s and 1970s saw an explosion of low-budget horror pictures specifically designed for the drive-in market. These films understood their audience and their venue. They were made quickly, often for very little money, and they embraced sensational elements that would provoke reactions from crowds. The titles alone suggested the kind of fare that late-night drive-in audiences could expect. Night of the Living Dead, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, Phantasm, Dawn of the Dead. These films pushed boundaries of violence and horror, creating images and scenarios designed to shock and disturb. They weren't subtle. They weren't restrained. They were visceral and immediate, and they worked particularly well in the drive-in environment. The outdoor setting enhanced the impact of horror films in ways that indoor theaters couldn't match. The darkness surrounding the cars created an atmosphere of isolation. The night sounds, wind rustling through trees, the distant highway, the occasional animal call, blended with the film's soundtrack, making the horror feel closer, more present. When a scary moment occurred on screen, you could hear reactions from other cars, screams, laughter, shouts, that amplified the experience. Jump scares got bigger reactions when you could hear dozens or hundreds of people responding simultaneously. The collective gasp or scream that followed a sudden shock created a wave of sound that rippled across the lot. This communal response became part of the appeal. You weren't just watching a horror film, you were experiencing it with a crowd, and their reactions fed back into your own experience, creating a loop of escalating intensity. The tension of a suspenseful scene was heightened by the environment. As the music built and the camera crept toward whatever horror was about to be revealed, you sat in your darkened car, aware of the night outside, conscious of how vulnerable you were in this open field. When the reveal came, the monster, the killer, the gruesome discovery, the impact landed harder because the boundaries between the film's world and your own felt thinner. Some horror films seemed designed specifically with the drive-in experience in mind. They included scenes set in cars or in outdoor locations that mirrored the drive-in setting. They featured young people in scenarios not unlike a drive-in outing gone wrong. The films created a playful terror that acknowledged their audience's situation. You were watching from the safety of your car, but the film suggested that cars and outdoor spaces weren't necessarily safe at all. The drive-in's physical layout contributed to the experience in unexpected ways. The rows of parked cars, arranged in the darkness with only the glow from the screen illuminating them, created a scene that could itself feel like something from a horror movie. The isolation of each vehicle, the shadows between cars, the empty spaces at the edges of the lot, all of this fed into the atmosphere that made horror films more effective. Some viewers genuinely frightened themselves at late-night horror shows. The combination of the film's content, the dark environment, the late hour, and the heightened emotional state created by being with a crowd could produce real fear. People would leave their cars to use the restroom and feel genuinely nervous walking across the lot, hyper-aware of shadows and sounds. This was part of the thrill, the reason people came, to be scared in a way that felt real but remained safely within the boundaries of entertainment. Others approached horror films with a more ironic distance. They laughed at the absurdities, mocked the cheap special effects, joked about plot holes and improbable scenarios. This playful engagement was equally valid, equally part of the drive-in culture. The films often seemed to invite this response, embracing their own campiness, their low budgets, their exploitation of sensational elements. The audience understood the game being played and participated willingly. The so-called B-movie culture that flourished in the 1960s and 1970s found its natural home at drive-ins. These were low-budget films made quickly and inexpensively, often focused on genre formulas, science fiction invasions, biker gangs, juvenile delinquents, monster attacks, disaster scenarios, beach parties, racing cars, motorcycle rebels. The films were rarely critically acclaimed, but they found devoted audiences who appreciated their energy, their willingness to be outrageous, and their unpretentious entertainment value. The term B-movie originally referred to the second feature in a double bill, but by the 1960s it had come to describe a style and approach to filmmaking. B-movies operated outside the mainstream studio system. They were made by independent producers who financed films through pre-sales to drive-ins and other venues. The budgets were minimal, sometimes just tens of thousands of dollars, occasionally less. The shooting schedules were compressed. A film might be shot in 2 weeks or even less. The production values were variable, ranging from competent to noticeably cheap. What B-movies lacked in polish, they often made up for in creativity and energy. Without the constraints of studio oversight or the need to appeal to the broadest possible audience, filmmakers could experiment with unusual ideas, controversial themes, and unconventional storytelling. Some B-movies were simply exploitation, cynical products designed to extract money from undiscriminating audiences, but others were genuinely innovative, using their freedom from mainstream expectations to try things that bigger films couldn't or wouldn't attempt. Directors like Roger Corman built entire careers on the B-movie model. Corman understood the economics perfectly. Make films cheaply, sell them to drive-ins and other venues before they were even finished. Use the guaranteed revenue to fund the next production. He became extraordinarily prolific, producing or directing hundreds of films over several decades. Some were forgettable, but others were influential, launching the careers of directors like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, and Jonathan Demme, all of whom worked for Corman early in their careers. The Corman formula was widely imitated. Small production companies would identify exploitable trends or topics, whatever was getting attention in the news or in popular culture, and quickly produce films capitalizing on that interest. When motorcycle gangs were in the news, suddenly there were a dozen biker films. When youth culture and rebellion became topics of discussion, films about juvenile delinquents appeared. When environmental concerns emerged, monster from pollution films showed up at drive-ins. These films had titles that promised more than they usually delivered. The Wild Angels, The Born Losers, The Blob, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, Teenage Caveman, The Wasp Woman, Little Shop of Horrors, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Raven, The Mask of the Red Death. The posters were lurid, featuring exaggerated imagery and sensational taglines. The actual films often couldn't match the promise of the marketing, but that was part of the appeal. The gap between expectation and reality became a source of humor and ironic enjoyment. Science fiction B-movies were particularly common at drive-ins during this era. The genre allowed for fantastic scenarios on minimal budgets. Alien invasions could be suggested with a few special effects and some creative camera work. Post-apocalyptic settings could be filmed in deserts or abandoned buildings. Monsters could be created with rubber suits and forced perspective. The films weren't technically sophisticated, but they tapped into Cold War anxieties, fears of nuclear war, concerns about technology and science, all filtered through pulp adventure narratives. Films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Forbidden Planet, and This Island Earth had been relatively high-budget science fiction from the 1950s, but they inspired countless cheaper imitators in the 1960s and 1970s. Drive-ins showed both the originals and the knockoffs, often paired together in double features that highlighted the differences in quality and budget. Beach party films represented another B-movie subgenre that thrived at drive-ins. Starting with Beach Party in 1963, these films featured young people, surfing, music, romance, and comedy in sun-drenched California settings. They were wholesome by the standards of other exploitation films, but they offered wish-fulfillment fantasies of endless summer, freedom from responsibility, and idealized youth. Titles like Muscle Beach Party, Bikini Beach, Beach Blanket Bingo, and How to Stuff a Wild Bikini followed, each essentially identical in structure, but offering familiar comfort to audiences. For teenagers at drive-ins, these beach party films represented aspirational lifestyles. The perpetual vacation, the absence of parents and authority figures, the focus on fun and romance. The films were rarely set in anything resembling reality, but that was part of their charm. They offered escape into a simplified world where the biggest concerns were who would win the surfing competition and which boy would end up with which girl. The biker film was a darker variation on the youth rebellion theme. Films like The Wild One from 1953 had established the template, but the 1960s saw an explosion of motorcycle gang films, often featuring real bikers in supporting roles and filming on location rather than on studio lots. The Wild Angels, Hell's Angels on Wheels, The Savage Seven, and many others presented motorcycle gangs as symbols of freedom and rebellion, though often with cautionary notes about violence and the limits of lawlessness. These films had an edge that beach party movies lacked. They featured real danger, real violence, sometimes real tragedy. They acknowledged a darker side of youth culture, the potential for rebellion to turn destructive. Yet they also romanticized the lifestyle, presenting bikers as free from society's constraints, living by their own rules, answerable to no one. Monster movies remained drive-in staples throughout this period. Giant creatures, whether created by radiation, scientific experiments, or alien origins, attacked cities, battled the military, threatened humanity. The monsters were often men in rubber suits, their destructive rampages achieved through miniature sets and forced perspective photography. The quality varied wildly, from the relatively sophisticated Japanese kaiju films, imported and dubbed into English, to ultra-low-budget American productions with visible zippers on monster costumes. The appeal of monster movies at drive-ins went beyond the creatures themselves. These films offered spectacle, cities destroyed, tanks and jets deployed, humanity uniting against a common threat. They provided clear moral frameworks. The monster was bad, stopping it was good. And they offered satisfying narratives where problems, however large, could be solved within 90 minutes. Double features became the standard format for drive-in programming during this era, particularly for late-night shows. The pairings were sometimes thematic: 2 horror films, 2 science fiction films, 2 beach movies. Other times they were opportunistic. Whatever films were available and affordable were paired together regardless of similarity. The double feature structure served multiple purposes. It provided value. 2 films for the price of 1 admission made the drive-in an economical evening out. It extended the event, starting at dusk in summer, and running 2 features meant the show didn't end until well past midnight, turning the drive-in visit into a substantial outing. And it allowed for risk. If the first feature disappointed, there was always the second film to potentially redeem the evening. Between the 2 features came the intermission, which evolved into an art form of its own. Theaters would show short films encouraging concession purchases, animated hot dogs and soft drinks dancing across the screen, singing jingles about the snack bar's offerings, countdowns showing how many minutes remained before the second feature began. These intermission films have become iconic pieces of drive-in culture, remembered with affection by people who grew up attending these theaters. The most famous featured dancing concessions: a hot dog, a box of popcorn, a soft drink cup, all with stick arms and legs, performing synchronized movements while singing about how delicious they were and encouraging viewers to visit the snack bar. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. The jingle was simple, catchy, and effective. Other intermission content included clocks counting down the minutes to the second feature, trivia questions displayed on screen, advertisements for local businesses, and trailers for upcoming attractions. The intermission lasted long enough for a substantial portion of the audience to visit the concession stand, make purchases, and return to their cars before the second feature began, typically 15 to 20 minutes. The walk to and from the concession stand during intermission became a social ritual. The parking lot, which had been dark and quiet during the first feature, suddenly filled with activity. People emerged from cars, stretching, talking, moving in streams toward the brightly lit concession building. The lot became a temporary pedestrian space, with cars remaining stationary while people navigated between them. The concession stand during intermission was organized chaos. Staff worked efficiently to serve potentially hundreds of customers in a short time window. Lines formed at order windows or counters. The menu boards glowed overhead, listing prices for popcorn, hot dogs, hamburgers, nachos, candy, soft drinks. The smell of popcorn and grilled food filled the air. Steam rose from cooking equipment. Staff called out orders, assembled food, took money, made change. For regular drive-in attendees, there was a strategy to intermission. Arrive at the concession stand early, before the rush. Know what you want before reaching the counter. Have money ready. Some people sent one person to get food while others held the spot in the car. Others made a family expedition of it, everyone going together, turning the concession visit into a break from sitting. The concession stand's interior was usually visible through large service windows. Customers could watch their food being prepared. Hot dogs rolling on heated cylinders, hamburgers sizzling on grills, popcorn tumbling in poppers. The transparency was partly practical. It allowed staff to communicate with customers, but it also added to the experience, making the food preparation part of the spectacle. The prices at drive-in concession stands were generally lower than indoor theaters, reflecting the drive-in's positioning as affordable family entertainment. But the profit margins were still substantial. The markup on popcorn, soda, and candy was significant. Theatre owners relied on these concession sales to make their operations profitable, as admission fees often just covered basic operating costs. Returning from the concession stand with armloads of food, cardboard trays holding hot dogs, paper bags of popcorn, drinks balanced precariously, became a skill developed through experience. The walk back to the car required navigating around other vehicles in the dark, avoiding spills, keeping everything balanced. Reaching the car successfully felt like a minor accomplishment. Once everyone was settled back in with their snacks, the countdown to the second feature created a sense of anticipation. The clock on screen ticked down. 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 3 minutes. People made final adjustments, bathroom trips, last-minute concession runs, settling children who had been playing during intermission. At 1 minute, conversations quieted. At 0, the screen went dark briefly. Then the second feature began. The second feature in a drive-in double bill was often a B movie, even if the first feature had been a more mainstream release. This reflected both economic realities, B movies were cheaper to license, and audience expectations. By the time the second feature started, it was late, people were tired and well-fed, and a less demanding film worked well. The second feature didn't need to be great, it just needed to be entertaining enough to justify staying rather than leaving after the first film. Some viewers left after the first feature, particularly families with young children. The kids had usually fallen asleep by then anyway, and parents were ready to head home. This created a gradual thinning of the lot as the evening progressed. The cars that remained for the second feature tended to contain teenagers, young adults without children, and dedicated film fans who had come specifically for the double bill. The late-night drive-in atmosphere was distinct. As midnight approached and passed, the lot took on a different character. The sense of being up late, of extending the day beyond its normal boundaries, created a slightly transgressive feeling. You were supposed to be home, supposed to be asleep, but instead you were here, in a field, watching a monster movie or a horror film, surrounded by other people making the same choice to resist sleep and normal schedules. This late-night quality made drive-ins feel like liminal spaces, not quite part of the normal daytime world, existing in a temporal zone that had its own rules and possibilities. The fatigue that came from staying up past your normal bedtime created a slightly altered state of consciousness, making the films seem stranger, more dreamlike, more impactful than they might have been earlier in the evening. For some viewers, particularly younger teenagers experiencing drive-ins for the first time, the late-night shows could be genuinely disorienting. The combination of frightening film content, physical tiredness, the dark environment, and the unfamiliar sensation of being out so late created experiences that lodged in memory with unusual vividness. Years later, people would remember specific late-night drive-in shows, not just because of the film, but because of the totality of the experience, how it felt to be there, at that hour, in that state. The drive-in's association with B-movies and horror during this era affected its cultural reputation. Some people viewed drive-ins as slightly disreputable, as venues for lowbrow entertainment that serious film lovers wouldn't patronize. The programming of exploitation films, the tolerance of rowdy teenage audiences, and the drive-in's role in youth culture all contributed to this perception. But for others, this was precisely the appeal. Drive-ins offered films that challenged mainstream sensibilities, that weren't afraid to be shocking or transgressive, that acknowledged the darker or more anarchic impulses of their audiences. The B-movie aesthetic, the visible low budgets, the earnest attempts to create spectacle with limited resources, the enthusiasm that overcame technical limitations, had its own validity, its own artistic merits that more polished productions sometimes lacked. Directors and actors who worked in B-movies often had freedom to experiment that they wouldn't have had in bigger productions. Without the pressure to deliver massive box office returns, without studio executives demanding changes, they could try unusual narrative structures, unconventional performances, themes and subjects that major studios avoided. Some of this experimentation failed, but some of it succeeded brilliantly, creating films that influenced later filmmakers and that have been retrospectively recognized for their innovation. The B-movie culture of the drive-in era has been extensively documented and celebrated in retrospect. Film festivals dedicated to these movies, books analyzing the genre, documentaries about the era. All of this attention has elevated what was once considered disposable entertainment into a subject of serious study and appreciation. The films have been preserved, restored, and made available to new generations who discover them decades after their original theatrical runs. This retrospective appreciation sometimes surprises people who lived through the era. Films that were considered cheap exploitation when they were new have become cult classics, beloved for their energy and their glimpses into the concerns and aesthetics of their time. Actors who worked primarily in B-movies have been rediscovered and celebrated. Directors who cranked out film after film for the drive-in market are now recognized as skilled craftspeople working within severe constraints. The drive-in's role in preserving and promoting this B-movie culture was crucial. These films needed venues willing to show them, audiences willing to watch them, and an exhibition context that matched their tone and approach. Drive-ins provided all of this. They gave B-movies the spaces where they could find their audiences, where the film's particular qualities could be appreciated rather than dismissed, where the theatrical experience enhanced rather than undermined the film's impact. By the mid-1970s, this golden age of drive-in B-movie culture was beginning to wane. The same economic and cultural forces that would challenge drive-ins generally were already at work. But the legacy remained in the films themselves, in the memories of audiences who attended, in the cultural impact of having had venues where this kind of cinema could flourish. The late-night drive-in, with its B-movies and horror films, its enthusiastic young audiences, its atmosphere of transgressive entertainment, represented a particular moment in American cultural history. It was a space where mainstream and marginal cultures intersected, where entertainment and social ritual intertwined, where the unique qualities of the drive-in format combined with a particular style of filmmaking to create experiences that couldn't be replicated anywhere else. Those experiences live on in memory, in the preserved films, in the stories people tell about their drive-in years. For many people who came of age in the 1960s and 1970s, the late-night drive-in remains a touchstone, a reminder of a time when entertainment could be rough-edged and unpolished, when audiences could be rowdy and participatory, when going to the movies was as much about the social experience as about the film itself. 1980s to 1990s, economic decline and the multiplex challenge. The 1980s brought accelerating decline for drive-in theaters. Multiple factors converged to make drive-ins less viable economically and less competitive as entertainment venues. One of the most significant was land value. Through the 1980s and 1990s, suburban development continued spreading outward from city centres. Land that had been semi-rural when a drive-in was built in the 1950s or 1960s was now surrounded by housing developments, shopping centres, and commercial districts. The value of that land had increased dramatically. For drive-in owners, this created difficult choices. The drive-in might be profitable enough to cover operating costs and provide modest income, but the land underneath it was worth millions of dollars. Developers would approach with offers, sell the property for a shopping mall, for a big-box retail store, for an apartment complex. The potential proceeds from such a sale often exceeded what decades of continued drive-in operation could generate. Some owners who wanted to keep their drive-ins operating found themselves unable to afford the rising property taxes. As surrounding land values increased, tax assessments on drive-in properties rose correspondingly. The business might be marginally profitable, but the taxes made continued operation financially unsustainable. The result was a steady stream of closures. Year by year through the 1980s and 1990s, drive-ins closed and were redeveloped. In some cases, the owners sold willingly, retiring or moving on to other ventures. In others, the decision was forced by financial pressures. Either way, the effect was the same. Screens came down, speaker posts were removed, and the land was cleared for new uses. Simultaneously, the indoor theatre business was transforming in ways that made drive-ins seem outdated by comparison. The multiplex cinema, a single building containing multiple theatres showing different films, began proliferating in the 1970s and became dominant in the 1980s and 1990s. Multiplexes offered several advantages over both traditional single-screen theatres and drive-ins. They could show multiple films simultaneously, staggering start times throughout the day and evening to maximize attendance. They provided climate-controlled comfort, air conditioning in summer, heat in winter, making the experience pleasant regardless of weather. They offered assigned seating in comfortable chairs with good sight lines. The viewing environment was controlled and predictable. For film distributors and studios, multiplexes were more attractive than drive-ins. A multiplex could show a film multiple times per day, generating more box office revenue from a single print. The controlled indoor environment ensured better presentation quality, no weather interference, better sound, consistent image quality, and multiplexes operated year-round, whereas drive-ins in many climates were seasonal businesses. Studios began giving multiplexes preferential access to new releases. The most anticipated films would open in multiplexes weeks or months before reaching drive-ins, if they reached drive-ins at all. This made it harder for drive-ins to compete. If families wanted to see the latest Disney animated film or summer blockbuster, they had to go to an indoor theater. By the time the film reached drive-ins, much of the potential audience had already seen it. Home entertainment technology also changed the competitive landscape. The widespread adoption of VCRs in the 1980s meant that families could rent movies and watch them at home on their own schedules. Video rental stores proliferated, offering huge selections of films for a few dollars per rental. The convenience was undeniable. No need to drive to a theater, no need to work around show times, no weather concerns, complete control over the viewing environment. Cable television expanded dramatically during this period as well, offering more channels and more film programming. Premium channels like HBO and Showtime showed recent films without commercials. Families could watch movies from their couch whenever they wanted, for a monthly subscription fee that was less than a few trips to any theater. These technologies didn't eliminate the appeal of theatrical movie-going, but they reduced the frequency with which people went to theaters, and they raised the bar for what a theater experience needed to offer to justify the trip. Multiplexes met that bar with comfort, convenience, and access to the latest releases. Drive-ins, with their aging infrastructure, limited programming, and weather-dependent operation, struggled to compete. Additional challenges emerged from changing environmental and regulatory contexts. Light pollution from expanding suburban development made it harder to maintain the darkness necessary for good outdoor projection. Street lights, commercial signs, parking lot lighting, and building illumination all contributed to background light that reduced image contrast on drive-in screens. Some drive-ins invested in brighter projection equipment and improved screens to compensate, but this was expensive. Others simply accepted that image quality wasn't what it once had been and tried to compete on other factors: nostalgia, the unique experience, lower prices. Noise ordinances sometimes created problems as well. As residential development encroached on what had been isolated drive-in locations, neighbors complained about sound from movies and from cars entering and leaving the lot. Some municipalities imposed noise restrictions that made operating a drive-in difficult or impossible. The speaker system itself was becoming an issue. Maintaining hundreds of individual speaker units was labor-intensive and expensive. Speakers broke, wires corroded, posts were damaged by cars or weather. The technology was reliable, but required constant maintenance. Some theaters experimented with AM or FM radio transmission as an alternative, broadcasting the audio on a radio frequency that viewers could receive on their car radios. This eliminated the speaker maintenance burden, but it required investment in transmission equipment, and some viewers disliked listening through their car stereos. Staffing challenges added to the difficulties. Operating a drive-in required projection staff, concession workers, ticket takers, security, and maintenance personnel. Finding and retaining reliable employees for seasonal, evening-hour work was an ongoing challenge. In an era of declining attendance and profit margins, labor costs consumed an increasing percentage of revenue. The cultural perception of drive-ins was changing as well. Younger generations who had grown up with VCRs and multiplexes didn't have the nostalgic attachment to drive-ins that their parents and grandparents had. For them, drive-ins seemed old-fashioned, a relic of their parents' youth rather than a contemporary entertainment option. The outdoor setting, which had once been a novelty and an attraction, now seemed less appealing compared to the comfort of indoor theatres with stadium seating and state-of-the-art sound systems. By the mid-1990s, the number of drive-ins had declined dramatically from the peak of the 1960s. From perhaps 4,000 or more at the height, numbers had fallen to perhaps 1,000 or fewer. Each year brought new closures. Some years saw brief stabilizations, or even small increases as remaining theatres found niches and loyal audiences, but the overall trend was unmistakably downward. The drive-ins that survived through this period tended to be in particular situations. Some were in regions with favourable weather and continued population density in their market areas. Others were run by dedicated owners who viewed the drive-in as a passion project rather than primarily a business, willing to accept modest returns to keep the theatre operating. A few had unique advantages: historic status that attracted tourists, locations that were particularly scenic or iconic, or programming strategies that created devoted followings. But for every theatre that survived, several closed. The landscape of American entertainment was changing, and the drive-in, which had seemed such a permanent fixture in the 1950s and 1960s, was revealed to be vulnerable to economic and technological forces that reshaped how people consumed movies and spent their leisure time. 21st century, digital conversion and the crisis of survival. The early 2000s brought a new existential challenge for the remaining drive-in theatres: the film industry's transition from 35mm film to digital projection. This technological shift, which occurred gradually through the 2000s and early 2000s, represented a crisis point for drive-ins that were already struggling with declining attendance and aging infrastructure. For most of cinema history, films had been distributed as physical prints, reels of 35mm film that were shipped to theatres, threaded onto projectors, and screened. The projectors needed for this were expensive but durable, and they could last for decades with proper maintenance. Many drive-ins were still using projection equipment that had been installed in the 1960s or 1970s. Digital cinema changed this model fundamentally. Instead of film prints, movies would be distributed as digital files, either on hard drives or via satellite transmission. Theatres needed digital projectors to display these files. The new projectors offered advantages: easier operation, no need to splice reels, better consistency in image quality, but they were expensive, often costing $70,000 to $100,000 or more per screen. For multiplex chains with dozens or hundreds of screens, the conversion was challenging but manageable. The cost could be amortized across all their screens, and studios sometimes helped with financing or subsidies. For small independent theatres, including drive-ins, the cost was potentially ruinous. A drive-in owner faced a stark choice: invest in a digital projector which might cost as much as the entire drive-in had earned in recent years, or face the reality that as studios stopped producing 35mm prints, the theatre would have no films to show. Some owners could afford the investment, many could not. This crisis prompted various responses. Some drive-ins simply closed, their owners determining that they couldn't justify the expense of digital conversion for a business that was already marginally profitable at best. These closures added to the ongoing attrition that had been reducing drive-in numbers for decades. Other drive-ins launched fundraising campaigns, appealing to their communities for help with the conversion costs. They framed the drive-in as a local institution worth preserving, a piece of cultural heritage that would be lost if the theatre couldn't afford to upgrade. Some campaigns succeeded, communities rallied, donations came in, and the drive-in managed to purchase the necessary equipment. Other campaigns fell short. The fundraising campaigns revealed how much emotional attachment people had to their local drive-ins, even if they didn't attend regularly. The drive-in represented memories of childhood, of first dates, of family outings. The idea that it might close prompted nostalgia and a desire to preserve something from the past. For communities that had already lost their drive-ins, the remaining theatres took on added significance as survivors, last representatives of a fading tradition. Some organizations emerged to help drive-ins with the digital conversion. The Honda Saliba 8 Summer Program, for example, provided grants to help 5 drive-ins purchase digital equipment in 2013. Other corporate sponsors, local foundations, and preservation organizations offered similar support in various cases. These interventions helped some theatres survive, though they couldn't address the entire industry's needs. The digital conversion crisis also prompted innovation in how drive-ins operated. Some theatres that made the transition to digital took advantage of the new technology's capabilities. Digital projection made it easier to show alternative content, sporting events, concerts, classic films from digital archives, even video game tournaments. Some drive-ins expanded their programming beyond standard Hollywood releases to include special events and niche content. The improved image quality from digital projection also helped drive-ins compete with indoor theatres in terms of technical presentation. When properly installed and maintained, digital projectors could produce images that rivaled or exceeded what was possible with 35mm film, especially in outdoor settings where dust and other environmental factors had always challenged film projection. Despite these advantages, the digital conversion didn't reverse the long-term decline in drive-in numbers. It simply created a new threshold that theatres had to cross to survive. Those that managed the transition continued operating, but often serving smaller audiences than in previous decades. 2010s to 2010s, nostalgia, adaptation, and finding new niches. The drive-ins that survived into the 2000s and 2000s increasingly position themselves as nostalgic experiences, appealing to people's memories of an earlier era. Marketing emphasized the retro, vintage quality of the drive-in experience. A night at the drive-in like your parents remember became a common pitch. This nostalgia wasn't just about the past. It tapped into broader cultural currents of interest in mid-century Americana, vintage design, and authentic experiences. In an era of digital ubiquity and highly mediated entertainment, the drive-in offered something that felt real and tangible. The night air, the massive physical screen, the social atmosphere of the parking lot. the ritual of the speaker or the radio tuner. Some drive-ins became destinations for people seeking this retro experience. Tourists would make special trips to visit historic drive-ins, adding them to road trip itineraries alongside other landmarks. The theaters that survived often had character, unique screens, vintage neon signs, classic concession stands that gave them visual and historical interest beyond just being places to watch movies. Operators adapted their business models in various ways. Many drive-ins shifted from purely movie exhibition to broader event hosting. They rented the facility for private events, birthday parties, corporate gatherings, fundraisers. They hosted car shows, where classic and custom vehicles were displayed during the day, followed by a movie screening in the evening. They organized themed events around holidays, Halloween horror marathons, 4th of July fireworks and films, summer kids series. The sound system evolution continued. Most drive-ins abandoned the old speaker-on-post system entirely, instead broadcasting audio via FM radio. This solved multiple problems simultaneously. No more speaker maintenance, better sound quality through car stereos, no risk of customers driving away with speakers attached. The transition required investment in FM transmission equipment, but this was far less expensive than maintaining hundreds of speaker units. Some viewers missed the speakers. The ritual of hooking the metal box onto the car window had been part of the drive-in experience for decades, and its absence changed the feel of attending. But the practical advantages of FM transmission were undeniable, and new generations of viewers didn't have the nostalgic attachment to the speakers that earlier generations had. Concession operations evolved as well. While traditional drive-in snacks, popcorn, hot dogs, candy, remained staples, many theaters expanded their offerings. Some added pizza, nachos, chicken fingers, and other items that hadn't been available in earlier decades. Others experimented with higher quality food, positioning the concession stand as a destination in itself rather than just a source of basic snacks. The economics of concessions remained crucial. With admission prices kept relatively low to stay competitive and attract families, concession sales often provided the difference between breaking even and generating actual profit. Theatre owners worked to balance offering value to customers with maintaining the margins needed to keep the business viable. Programming strategies became more sophisticated. Drive-ins learned to target specific demographics with particular film choices. Family-friendly programming on weekends, late-night horror or action films on Friday and Saturday nights, targeting teenagers and young adults. Classic film series appealing to older audiences seeking nostalgia. Some theaters partnered with local film societies or preservation organizations to show restored classic films, creating events that attracted cinephiles interested in seeing these films on a big screen. Double features remained common, providing value and distinguishing the drive-in from multiplexes, where each film required separate admission. The double feature also helped fill the evening. Starting at dusk in summer might mean beginning at 8:30 or 9 p.m., and without a second film, the show would end by 11. Adding a second feature extended the evening to 1 a.m. or later, making the outing feel more substantial. Some drive-ins added multiple screens, transforming from single-screen operations to mini multiplexes. This allowed them to show different films simultaneously, appealing to different audiences and increasing the chance that any given visitor would find something they wanted to watch. The additional screens required more projection equipment and more complex operations, but they increased potential revenue and provided programming flexibility. Social media became an important tool for drive-ins in the 2000s. Theaters used Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to announce programming, share photos, build community, and market special events. The visual nature of drive-ins, the iconic screens, the rows of cars, the nostalgic aesthetic, made them naturally suited to social media sharing. Visitors would post photos of their drive-in outings, inadvertently providing free marketing and reinforcing the theater's cultural cachet. Online ticketing emerged as well, allowing drive-ins to sell admission in advance through their websites. This helped with capacity management. On busy nights, selling tickets ahead of time prevented overcrowding and long waits at the gate. It also provided data on advance demand that helped with staffing and concession preparation. Despite these adaptations, the fundamental challenges remained. Operating costs continued to rise, property taxes increased, maintenance needs didn't diminish. Competition from home theaters with large screens and streaming services intensified. The drive-in remained a fragile business model, dependent on weather, location, dedicated ownership, and community support. The number of operating drive-ins stabilized somewhat in the 2000s after decades of decline. Industry counts suggested perhaps 300 to 400 theaters remained in operation in the United States, down from the thousands that had existed in the 1960s, but representing a plateau after the steep declines of the 1980s and 1990s. The theaters that survived had generally found sustainable niches, developed devoted audiences, and managed the various challenges facing the business. The COVID-19 pandemic, an unexpected revival. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic created unprecedented disruption to entertainment and social life. Indoor theaters closed or operated under severe restrictions. Restaurants, bars, concerts, sports events, all the ways people typically gathered socially, were shut down or limited. People sought ways to have experiences outside their homes while minimizing disease transmission risk. Drive-in theaters found themselves uniquely suited to this moment. The car-based format meant that each group was isolated from others. There was no shared indoor air. Contact with staff could be minimized. People could watch a movie on a big screen, have a social outing, feel a sense of normalcy, all while maintaining physical distance from others. Attendance at existing drive-ins surged. Theaters that had been struggling to attract audiences suddenly found themselves selling out on weekends. People who had never been to a drive-in before came to experience it. Families with children seeking any kind of outing embraced the drive-in as a safe option. The combination of novelty, safety, and entertainment created unprecedented demand. Communities that had lost their drive-ins years or decades earlier created temporary ones. Parking lots, fairgrounds, sports fields, any large open space with room for cars and a clear sightline became potential screening venues. Organizations set up inflatable screens, portable projection equipment, and FM transmitters, creating pop-up drive-ins. These temporary drive-ins varied in quality and professionalism. Some were well-organized operations that replicated the traditional drive-in experience effectively. Others were more improvised, with smaller screens, lower quality projection, or logistical challenges. But they served a need, providing entertainment options when few alternatives existed. The pandemic also led to creative uses of drive-in formats for non-film events. Churches held drive-in services, with congregants sitting in cars and listening to sermons through their radios. Graduations were held in drive-in formats when traditional ceremonies weren't possible. Concerts used drive-in setups, with musicians performing on stages in front of screens, showing visual accompaniment. For existing drive-ins, the pandemic boom was welcome, but bittersweet. Yes, attendance was up dramatically, but the reasons for that increase were tragic, and there was uncertainty about whether the renewed interest would persist once the pandemic ended and indoor theatres reopened. As restrictions eased through 2021 and 2022, the pandemic-driven surge in drive-in attendance gradually declined. People returned to indoor theatres, to restaurants, to their pre-pandemic entertainment patterns. The temporary pop-up drive-ins mostly shut down. Attendance at permanent drive-ins fell from the pandemic peaks, but stabilized at levels somewhat higher than before 2020. The pandemic had reminded people that drive-ins existed and that they offered something distinctive. Some first-time visitors during the pandemic became repeat customers afterward, having discovered an experience they enjoyed. The increased visibility and positive press coverage gave drive-ins a boost in cultural awareness. But the pandemic didn't fundamentally change the economics or the long-term challenges facing drive-ins. The same issues that had created decades of decline remained: land values, competition from home entertainment, seasonal limitations in many climates, the costs of maintenance and operation. The pandemic surge was an exception, not a permanent reversal of fortune. Today, quiet survival and cultural significance. As of the early 2000s, approximately 300 drive-in theatres operate in the United States. This represents a small fraction of the peak numbers from the 1960s, but it also represents a kind of equilibrium. The theatres that have survived have generally found ways to make the business model work, whether through dedicated ownership, ideal locations, community support, or successful adaptation to contemporary conditions. These surviving drive-ins occupy an interesting cultural position. They're no longer mainstream entertainment venues in the way they were during their peak. Most people don't go to drive-ins regularly, and many Americans, particularly younger ones, have never been to one. But drive-ins maintain a presence in the cultural imagination that exceeds their actual numbers. They appear frequently in films and television shows set in the 1950s through 1970s, where they serve as shorthand for a particular kind of American experience. They feature in nostalgic recollections of childhood and youth. They're invoked in discussions of American car culture, of outdoor entertainment, of community gathering spaces. This cultural significance creates value beyond just the business operations. Drive-ins function as live-in history, as places where people can experience something close to what their parents or grandparents experienced decades ago. This heritage dimension attracts visitors who might not otherwise go to movies regularly, but who want the specific experience of a drive-in. Some drive-ins have received historic designation or preservation recognition, formally acknowledging their cultural importance. These designations can sometimes help with fundraising, with tax considerations, or with community support for continued operation. They mark the drive-in as more than just a business, as a piece of local history worth preserving. The architecture of surviving drive-ins varies. Some have maintained their vintage screens and buildings, carefully preserving the original character. Others have been updated with new screens, modern projection booths, and renovated concession stands that keep the nostalgic feel while improving functionality. A few have compromised historic character for operational efficiency, though these risk losing the distinctive aesthetic that makes drive-ins special. Sound systems are now universally FM transmission. The old speaker posts have become collectibles, sold to nostalgia enthusiasts or kept as decoration at some theatres. The transition to FM was complete enough by the 2000s that few people attending drive-ins today remember the speaker era from personal experience. Programming at contemporary drive-ins balances several considerations. Access to first-run films depends on relationships with distributors and on the drive-in's location and audience. Major studios may provide recent releases to drive-ins that can guarantee adequate attendance, but access isn't universal. Some drive-ins supplement first-run films with older titles, classic films, or genre programming. Special events have become more important to many drive-ins. Horror marathons around Halloween, Christmas film series, summer kids programs, car shows, and vintage vehicle meetups. These events create additional revenue streams and build community engagement beyond just showing current movies. Pricing remains competitive. Drive-ins typically charge significantly less than indoor theatres, particularly for families or groups that can share a vehicle. The per-car pricing model that began with Hollingshead's original theatre in 1933 persists at many drive-ins, making them economical for larger groups. The typical drive-in evening in the 2000s follows patterns that would be recognizable to someone from the 1960s, albeit with some changes. Arrive at dusk, pay admission at the gate, find a parking spot with a good view of the screen. Tune the car radio to the specified FM frequency. Visit the concession stand, return to the car, watch the film. The ritual is largely unchanged, which is part of the appeal. What has changed is the broader context. In the 1960s, attending a drive-in was an ordinary activity, one option among several for weekend entertainment. Today, it's more of an event, a deliberate choice to seek out a particular kind of experience. People who go to drive-ins now often do so with awareness that they're participating in something historic, something that might not last forever, something that connects them to earlier eras of American life. The landscape of memory. The car sits in its space, engine off, radio playing the movie's audio through the speakers. On the screen, images move through their projected story. Around the lot, other cars are arranged in their rows, their occupants watching the same screen, hearing the same soundtrack, sharing the same moment in different private spaces. Above, the sky darkens fully into night. Stars become visible, though not as many as would be visible away from light pollution. The screen glows, a rectangle of light against the darkness, visible for miles to anyone who happens to look in this direction. This scene has played out millions of times over 90 years of drive-in history. Different cars, different faces, different films, but the essential elements remaining constant. The open field, the big screen, the night sky, the gathered community of isolated individuals, each in their vehicle, each watching together while apart. The history that led to this moment stretches back to Richard Hollingshead's driveway experiments, through the innovations of the 1940s, through the explosive growth of the postwar years, through the peak era of the 1960s. Through decades of decline and adaptation, through the digital crisis, through the pandemic surge, to the present moment of quiet survival. That history lives in the drive-ins that remain, in their screens and their lots and their concession stands. It lives in the memories of the millions of people who attended drive-ins during their peak years. It lives in the cultural artifacts, photographs, films, songs, books that captured the drive-in experience and preserved it for future generations. For someone lying in bed listening to this history, the image is easy to construct. Rows of cars facing a towering screen, the glow of the projection illuminating the field, the sounds of the film mixing with night sounds, the sense of being part of something both communal and private, both contemporary and historical. The drive-in represents something about American culture, the centrality of the automobile, the value placed on private space and personal comfort, the desire for entertainment that accommodates family needs, the capacity for innovation in combining technologies and social patterns in new ways. It represents a moment in time when these elements aligned to create something that seemed perfect for its era. That era has largely passed. The conditions that made drive-ins ideal in the 1950s and 1960s changed. New technologies offered different advantages, cultural patterns shifted, economic forces reshaped landscapes. The drive-in, which had seemed such a natural and permanent part of American life, revealed itself to be contingent on specific circumstances that were themselves temporary. But the drive-ins that remain continue their work. They show films, they serve popcorn, they provide spaces for gathering. They connect present-day viewers to the history of American entertainment and to the experiences of earlier generations. They persist as representatives of a different time, as functional monuments to a particular way of watching movies and spending evenings together. The film plays on, the night deepens. The cars sit in their rows, facing the screen, their occupants absorbed in the projected story, or in conversation, or in their own thoughts. The concession stand's lights glow. The FM signal transmits its audio. The projector hums its steady work. This is what remains of the drive-in era, not the thousands of theaters that once existed, but the few hundred that survived, carrying forward a tradition, maintaining a connection to the past, offering an experience that has become rare enough to be special. The highway stretches past in the distance, cars moving along it unaware of the drive-in in the field beyond the lights. Some drivers might notice the glow of the screen, might remember attending drive-ins in their youth, might feel a moment of nostalgia before continuing on their way. The screen shows its images to whoever has come to watch. The lot holds its cars, arranged in their precise rows. The speaker posts are gone, but the FM transmitters do their work. The snack bar serves its food. The projector throws its light across hundreds of feet of darkness to create pictures on the distant screen. And somewhere in that lot, a child is falling asleep in a back seat, wrapped in a blanket, lulled by the voices from the radio and the gentle rocking as a parent shifts position in the front seat. In the morning, they might not remember what movie was playing, but they'll remember being there, being at the drive-in, being part of that experience that has defined summer nights for generations of American families. The story continues, even now, at the drive-ins that remain. New memories are being formed, new experiences of this old form of entertainment. The tradition persists, changed from its peak but recognizably connected to its origins, maintaining the essential elements that made the drive-in special: the outdoor setting, the big screen, the car-based viewing, the sense of occasion. The projector hums, the screen glows, the cars sit in darkness. The night holds everything gently, the way it has held drive-in theaters for 90 years, the way it will hold them for as long as they continue to operate, as long as people continue to drive out at dusk to watch movies under the stars. The field is quiet except for the movie's sound and the occasional car door closing as someone heads to the concession stand. The temperature drops slightly as night progresses. A breeze moves across the lot, carrying the smell of popcorn and the faint sounds of the highway. This moment, this scene, this experience, it's the same as countless others that have occurred at drive-ins over the decades. The specific details change, the cars are different models, the screen technology has evolved, the films being shown are new rather than vintage. But the fundamental experience remains recognizable to anyone who attended a drive-in in any era. That continuity is part of the drive-in's appeal. In a world of constant change, where technologies replace each other in rapid succession and cultural patterns shift with increasing speed, the drive-in offers something stable, something that has maintained its basic form across generations. It's a bridge to the past, accessible in the present. The film approaches its conclusion. The plot resolves. The characters find their endings. The story wraps itself into completion. In the cars, viewers watch the final scenes, some engaged until the last moment, others already thinking about the drive home, about what time they'll arrive, about the next day's obligations. Credits begin to roll. Some cars start their engines immediately, pulling out of their spaces and heading toward the exit. Others wait, letting the lot clear a bit before joining the flow of departing traffic. A few stay through the entire credit sequence, either out of respect for the filmmakers or simply because they're comfortable and in no hurry to leave. The lot empties gradually. What was a full field of vehicles becomes half full, then scattered with cars, then nearly empty. The screen shows the credits to fewer and fewer viewers. Eventually, the film ends completely. The screen goes dark, and the few remaining cars start their engines and depart. By the time the last car leaves, the lot is dark except for security lights. The screen stands silent against the night sky. The concession stand is closed, its lights off, its staff gone home. The FM transmitter is switched off. The projector is shut down. The drive-in rests, waiting for the next night, the next show, the next group of viewers who will drive out to watch movies under the stars. Tomorrow or the next day, or next weekend, the cycle will repeat, cars will arrive, the screen will light up, films will play, the drive-in will do its work again. This has been the pattern for 90 years. It continues at the drive-ins that remain. It will continue as long as theatres can sustain operations, as long as people value the experience enough to support it, as long as the specific combination of factors that make a drive-in viable persist. The field is empty now, the screen is dark, the night is quiet, but the drive-in remains, ready for the next showing, the next audience, the next chapter in a story that began in a New Jersey driveway in 1932 and continues in fields and lots across America today. The stars overhead are the same stars that have looked down on drive-in theaters throughout their history. The same sky that covered the first drive-in in 1933, that watched over the peak years of the 1960s, that witnessed the decline of the 1980s and 1990s, that saw the pandemic surge of 2020, that observes the quiet survival of the present day. Under that sky, Drive-in theaters have shown tens of thousands of films to hundreds of millions of viewers. They've been backgrounds for first dates and family outings, for childhood memories and teenage adventures, for social gatherings and private moments. They've been places where communities came together, where individuals found entertainment and escape, where the simple act of watching a movie became something more, an experience, a tradition, a connection to something larger than any single visit. The history is there in the drive-ins that remain, in their screens and their lots and their memories. It's there in the photographs and films that captured the drive-in era. It's there in the recollections of people who attended, who remember the speakers and the snack bars and the glow of the screen against the night sky. And it's there in the present, in the operating theaters that continue the tradition, that offer new generations the chance to experience something that has been part of American life for 9 decades, that provide continuity between past and present, that demonstrate that some experiences, some forms of entertainment, some ways of gathering together, can endure even as the world around them changes. The highway carries its traffic into the distance. The field rests in darkness. The drive-in waits, patient and persistent, for the next evening when cars will arrive, the screen will glow, and stories will unfold against the vast canvas of the night sky. This is the history of drive-in movie theaters, from experiment to institution, to endangered tradition, to surviving heritage. It's a history of American culture, of technology and society, of entertainment and community, of change and persistence. It's a history that continues to be written in small increments at the theaters that remain. The night deepens, the stars turn overhead, their slow rotation marking time in the way they have for billions of years, indifferent to the human activities below. The drive-in rests in darkness now, the lot empty, except for perhaps a single security light near the concession building, casting a small pool of illumination that doesn't reach the distant corners of the field. The screen stands silent against the sky, its white surface barely visible in the starlight. During the day, it's a functional structure showing its age, paint peeling in places, the framework visible where panels have weathered. But at night, when it's not illuminated by the projector's beam, it becomes almost invisible, a dark rectangle that blends into the darkness behind it. Only its outline is perceptible, a geometric shape interrupting the natural horizon. The speaker posts, those few that remain as decorative elements at some theaters, stand in their rows like markers in a field. Most drive-ins removed them years ago, when the transition to FM radio transmission made them obsolete. But at a few locations, they were left in place, either from inertia or from a sense that they were part of the drive-in's character, part of what made it recognizable as this particular kind of place. They serve no function now except as reminders, as physical evidence of how things used to work. The concession building sits dark and quiet. Inside, the equipment has been cleaned and shut down. The popcorn machine is empty, its kettle wiped clean. The grills are cool. The refrigerators hum their steady work, keeping tomorrow's inventory at proper temperature. The cash registers are closed out, the day's receipts counted and secured. The floors have been swept, the counters wiped down. Everything ready for the next day's business, or for the next weekend, if this is a Sunday night. In the projection booth, the digital projector sits powered down, its sophisticated electronics in standby mode. The hard drives containing the films are stored securely. The sound system is off. The FM transmitter is silent. The booth itself is locked, a small fortress of technology that will come to life again when needed, but now rests in the darkness. The parking lot surface shows the marks of thousands of vehicles, tire tracks in the gravel or on the pavement, oil stains from cars that leaked, the slight depressions where vehicles have parked repeatedly in the same spots over years. The painted lines that mark the spaces where they exist are faded in places, repainted periodically, but always showing where. The ramps that create the elevation changes between rows are permanent features, shaped into the land itself, visible even in darkness as subtle contours in the terrain. Around the perimeter of the drive-in, the fence or barrier that marks the property line separates this space from what surrounds it. In some cases, that's agricultural land, fields of corn or soybeans, pasture for livestock, orchards. In others, it's commercial development, shopping centres, office parks, housing subdivisions that have grown up around what was once an isolated drive-in on the edge of town. The contrast between the drive-in's open field and the developed land around it highlights how unusual these spaces have become, how rare it is to find large open areas preserved for a single purpose in landscapes that have been subdivided and built upon. The highway in the distance carries its nighttime traffic, fewer vehicles than during the day, but a steady stream nonetheless. Trucks making long-haul runs, cars with drivers heading home from late shifts, travelers passing through, their destinations elsewhere. Some of these drivers might notice the drive-in as they pass, might see the screen silhouetted against the sky, might register it as a landmark or a curiosity. Others pass without noticing, their attention on the road ahead, the drive-in just another darkened structure in the landscape. For those who do notice, the reactions vary. Older drivers might feel a flash of recognition, of memory. They attended drive-ins in their youth, and seeing one now brings back those experiences. The particular quality of the image on the enormous screen, the sound through the car speakers or radio, the feeling of being there with family or friends or on a date, the specific movies they saw, and how those films have become entangled with memories of that period of their lives. Younger drivers might not immediately recognize what they're seeing. The concept of a drive-in theatre might be unfamiliar, or it might be something they've heard about but never experienced. The large screen in an empty field might seem puzzling until they understand its purpose, and even then, it might seem like an artifact from another era, a curiosity rather than a living part of the entertainment landscape. But the drive-in remains, regardless of how it's perceived by those who pass. It continues to exist, to occupy this space, to serve its purpose when called upon. The business model may be precarious, the economics challenging, the long-term future uncertain. But for now, for this moment, it persists. The persistence itself is meaningful. Each drive-in that remains in operation represents a choice, by its owners to continue despite difficulties, by its community to support it through attendance and advocacy, by the broader culture to value what it represents, even if that value isn't primarily economic. These choices, made repeatedly over years and decades, keep drive-ins alive in a landscape where they could easily disappear entirely. The drive-in waits for tomorrow, or for next weekend, or for next spring if this is the end of the operating season. The wait is patient. The facility doesn't degrade significantly in a few days or weeks of non-use. The screen stands, the projection booth remains, the concession building holds its equipment. The lot is ready to receive cars when they arrive. This patience, this readiness to spring back to life when needed, characterizes drive-ins in their current era. They're not constantly active like multiplexes that show films every day of the year. They're seasonal in many climates, or they operate only on weekends, or they schedule shows based on weather and expected attendance. This intermittent operation is part of what makes them sustainable. Lower operating costs allow them to survive on smaller audiences, but it also means that much of the time, drive-ins sit empty, waiting. The waiting contains potential. The next show could be well attended or poorly attended, could feature a popular new release or an old classic, could be blessed with perfect weather or challenged by rain or cold. Each showing is an event, an occasion that stands alone rather than being one iteration in a continuous daily schedule. This gives individual showings significance, makes them memorable in ways that routine weekly moviegoing often isn't. For the people who will attend the next show, whenever it occurs, the drive-in offers something that other venues can't quite match. The scale of the screen creates an immersive visual experience. The outdoor setting connects viewers to the natural world. They feel the temperature, smell the night air, hear sounds beyond the film's soundtrack. The car-based viewing provides privacy and comfort, a personal space within a communal setting. The relaxed atmosphere allows for flexibility. Children can sleep, conversations can happen, movement is possible. That formal indoor theatres don't permit. These qualities have kept drive-ins viable, even as their numbers have declined dramatically. The hundreds that remain serve audiences who value these specific attributes, who choose the drive-in experience deliberately, rather than simply as a default option. This self-selected audience tends to be more appreciative, more forgiving of the drive-in's limitations, more understanding of what makes this form of exhibition special. The cultural significance of drive-ins extends beyond the people who currently attend them. They represent a connection to American history, to the mid-20th century when car culture shaped the landscape and when outdoor entertainment was a normal part of summer evenings. They're symbols of a particular approach to leisure and community, of a time when families loaded into cars for evening outings, when teenagers had places to gather that were acceptable to parents but provided some independence, when entertainment didn't require air conditioning and assigned seating and sophisticated sound systems. This symbolic dimension means that drive-ins matter even to people who never attend them. They're part of the cultural landscape, touchstones in collective memory, references in films and books and songs. Their continued existence, even in small numbers, maintains a connection to that history, keeps alive the possibility of experiencing something that was once commonplace but has become rare. The preservation of drive-ins sometimes becomes a community cause. When a drive-in is threatened with closure, local residents who may not have attended in years will rally to support it. They'll donate to fundraising campaigns, volunteer for work parties, spread word about the theatre's situation. This mobilization reflects an understanding that some things have value beyond their economic productivity, that preserving pieces of cultural heritage is worthwhile even when it requires effort and resources. Not all drive-ins can be saved. Some close despite community support because the economic realities are too stark, the challenges too great, the land is too valuable, the costs too high, the audience too small. When these closures happen, They're often mourned, covered in local news, marked by final screenings that draw crowds of people coming to say goodbye to a place that held their memories. But the drive-ins that survive these various challenges, the economic pressures, the technological transitions, the changing entertainment landscape, the passage of time, carry forward a tradition that stretches back 90 years. They're not museums showing films to tourists as historical demonstrations. They're working theatres, serving contemporary audiences, adapting to current conditions while maintaining essential continuity with their origins. The continuity is visible in the basic elements that remain unchanged. The large outdoor screen, the parking lot arranged in rows facing that screen, the transmission of sound to individual cars, the concession stand selling popcorn and hot dogs, the experience of watching movies outdoors, under the sky, in your vehicle. These fundamentals have persisted from the 1930s to the present, through all the changes in technology and culture and economics. This persistence suggests something important about the drive-in concept. It addresses needs that don't disappear just because new technologies emerge or social patterns shift. The need for affordable family entertainment, the desire for experiences that combine privacy and community, the appeal of being outdoors on pleasant evenings, the simple pleasure of watching stories unfold on a large screen. These needs and desires haven't gone away, and drive-ins continue to serve them in ways that other forms of exhibition can't quite replicate. The next show, whenever it occurs, will add to this history. It will create new memories for the people who attend. A family will bring young children who will fall asleep in the back seat, just as children have done for decades. A couple will have a first date, sitting in a car watching a film, experiencing the same mixture of nervousness and excitement that countless other couples have felt at drive-ins over the years. A group of friends will gather, bringing lawn chairs and snacks, treating the drive-in as a social event as much as a movie screening. These individual experiences will be unique to the people involved, but they'll also be part of patterns that have repeated millions of times over the history of drive-in theatres. The specific details change. The cars are different models. The films are new releases rather than classics. The technology for transmitting sound has evolved. But the fundamental experience remains recognizable across decades. The sky above the drive-in is the same sky that covered the first drive-in in 1933, that watched over the peak years of the 1960s, that witnessed the struggles of the 1980s and 1990s, that saw the pandemic surge of 2020. The stars in that sky have barely moved in their cosmic positions during the entire span of drive-in history. Their light, traveling for years across space, illuminates the drive-in lot whether or not any cars are present, whether or not any film is being shown. The land beneath the drive-in has its own history, longer than the drive-in's 90 years. It was something else before it became a drive-in. Perhaps farmland, perhaps forest, perhaps prairie or desert, depending on the region. It will be something else after the drive-in is gone, if that time comes. But for now, for this extended present that includes the past several decades and extends into an uncertain future, it is a drive-in theatre, shaped and used for this specific purpose. The shaping is visible in the land itself, the grading that creates the ramped parking rows, the cleared area where the screen stands, the levelled space for the concession building and projection booth, the access roads and parking lot surfaces. All of this represents human effort to transform raw land into a specialized entertainment venue, work that was done decades ago and that persists in the physical form of the property. Maintaining that physical form requires ongoing effort. The grass needs mowing, the pavement needs repair, the screen needs painting, the buildings need maintenance. Weather and time constantly work to erode and degrade, and human labor must constantly counter these forces to keep the facility functional. This maintenance work is largely invisible to visitors who see only the finished product, but it's essential to the drive-in's continued operation. The people who do this work, the owners, the staff, the volunteers who help with various tasks, are part of the drive-in story too. Their labor and dedication keep these places running. In many cases, the work is done not primarily for profit, which may be modest or non-existent, but from a sense of stewardship, a belief that the drive-in is worth preserving, that it serves a purpose beyond just financial return. This dedication manifests in various ways. Owners who could sell the property for substantial profit but choose to continue operating the drive-in. Staff who work for modest wages because they enjoy the work and believe in the mission. Volunteers who donate time to help with maintenance or special events because they value having a drive-in in their community. This human dimension, the choices people make to support drive-ins, is as important as the physical infrastructure or the business model. The relationships formed around drive-ins add another layer to their significance. Families who have attended the same drive-in across generations, who can point to the spot where they always tried to park, who remember which playground equipment their children played on before shows. Couples who return to the drive-in where they had their first date, now bringing their own children. Communities that gather at the drive-in for special events, creating shared experiences that strengthen social bonds. These relationships and memories give drive-ins meaning beyond their function as entertainment venues. They become places that hold community history, repositories of collective experience, landmarks in the personal geographies that people construct of their lives. When someone drives past their old drive-in, even if it's been closed for years, they see not just a property, but a container for memories. Summer nights, first kisses, family outings, films watched and mostly forgotten, but the experience of watching remembered vividly. The drive-in's future is uncertain in the way that all futures are uncertain, but particularly so for businesses operating in challenging economic conditions with aging infrastructure and evolving competition. Each drive-in faces its own specific challenges and opportunities, its own calculation of whether continued operation is viable, its own timeline of sustainability. Some will close in coming years, unable to overcome the various pressures they face. When they do, they'll join the thousands that have already closed, adding to the historical record of drive-ins that once were. Their screens will come down, their lots will be cleared, their land will be repurposed. The memories will persist longer than the physical structures, carried by people who attended, passed down through stories, preserved in photographs and films. Others will continue, finding ways to adapt and survive, serving their communities for years or decades more. They'll modernize where necessary, preserve what's essential, balance change and continuity. They'll mark anniversaries, 50 years, 75 years, some approaching or surpassing a century of operation. These milestone celebrations will draw attention to how remarkable it is that any drive-in survives so long, how much dedication and adaptation that survival requires. New drive-ins might even emerge, though this seems unlikely given the economics and the land requirements. Occasionally, someone with resources and vision decides to build a drive-in where none exists, recognizing that there's still demand for this experience. These new operations benefit from modern technology and can be designed from the start to meet current expectations, but they also must establish themselves in a landscape where drive-ins are no longer a familiar part of the entertainment infrastructure. But whether old or new, whether struggling or thriving, whether uncertain of next year or confident in their future, the drive-ins that exist today share common attributes. They're outdoor theaters built around automobiles. They show films on large screens to audiences in cars. They represent continuity with a tradition that reaches back 90 years. They offer experiences that can't quite be replicated elsewhere. They matter to the people who use them and to the communities where they operate. The night continues its slow progression toward dawn. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The drive-in rests, neither fully sleeping nor fully awake, but waiting with the patience of structures built for durability, designed to last, maintained through care and effort. The story that began with Richard Hollingshead's experiments in his driveway continues in these quiet fields where screens stand against the sky and where cars will gather again to watch movies in the darkness. It continues in the memories of millions who attended drive-ins during their peak decades. It continues in the cultural presence of drive-ins in films and books and collective imagination. It continues in the work of those who maintain the remaining theaters. It continues in each screening, each family outing, each first date, each late-night horror marathon. The continuation isn't guaranteed. The story could end if all drive-ins close, if the economics become impossible, if changing patterns eliminate the audience entirely. But for now, for this moment, the story goes on. The drive-ins remain. The tradition persists. The experience is still available to those who seek it. And so the field waits, and the screen stands, and the night holds everything gently, the history, and the present, and the uncertain future, all contained in this space where land and technology and memory combine to create something that is both simple and irreplaceable, both ordinary and remarkable, both a business and a cultural landmark. The darkness deepens toward the hour before dawn, when the night is at its quietest and most complete. The drive-in rests in that darkness, ready for tomorrow, for the next show, for the continuation of a story that began 90 years ago and continues still, in the quiet fields where screens stand against the sky and cars gather to watch movies in the darkness, under the vast, patient stars that have witnessed all of it and will witness whatever comes next.